How about this? An excerpt from Will You Please Be Quiet, Please? Stories by Raymond Carver. How about this? All the optimism that had colored his flight from the city was gone now, had vanished the evening of the first day, as they drove north through the dark strands of redwood. Now, the rolling pasture land, the cows, the isolated farmhouses of western Washington seemed to hold out nothing for him, nothing he really wanted. He had expected something different. He drove on and on with a rising sense of hopelessness and outrage. He kept the car at 50, all that the road allowed. Sweat stood on his forehead and over his upper lip, and there was a sharp, heady odor of clover in the air all around them. The land began to change. The highway dipped suddenly, crossed a culvert, rose again, and then the asphalt ran out and he was holding the car on a country dirt road, an astonishing trail of dust rising behind them. As they passed the ancient burned-out foundation of a house set back among some maple trees, Emily removed her dark glasses and leaned forward, staring. "That is the old Owens place," she said. "He and Dad were friends. He kept a sill in his attic and had a big team of dray horses he used to enter in all the fairs. He died with a ruptured appendix when I was about 10 years old. The house burned down a year later at Christmas. Then they moved to Bremerton after that."
"Is that so?" he said. "Christmas. Then, do I turn right or left here? Emily? Right or left?"
"Left," she said. "Left." She put on her glasses again, only to take them off a moment later. "Stay on this road, Harry, until you come to another crossroad. Then right. Only a little farther then." She smoked steadily, one cigarette after the other, was silent now as she looked out at the cleared fields, at the isolated strands of fir trees, at the occasional weathered house. He shifted down, turned right. The road began to drop gradually into a lightly wooded valley. Far ahead, Canada, he supposed. He could see a range of mountains, and behind those mountains a darker, still higher range. "There's a little road," she said, "at the bottom. That's the road." He turned carefully and drove down the rutted track road slowly, waiting for the first sign of the house. Emily sat next to him, edgy, he could see, smoking again, also waiting for the first glimpse. He blinked his eyes as low, shaggy branches slapped the windshield. She leaned forward slightly and touched her hand to his leg. "Now," she said. He slowed almost to a stop, drove through a tiny clear puddle of a stream that came out of the high grass on his left, then into a mass of dogwood that fingered and scraped the length of the car as the little road climbed. "There it is," she said, moving her hand from his leg. After the first unsettling glance, he kept his eyes on the road. He looked at the house again after he had brought the car to a stop near the front door. Then he licked his lips, turned to her, and tried to smile.
"Well, we're here,"
he said. She was looking at him, not looking at the house at all. Harry had always lived in cities. San Francisco for the last 3 years, and before that Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York. But for a long time he had wanted to move to the country, somewhere in the country. At first he wasn't too clear about where he wanted to go. He just knew he wanted to leave the city to try to start over again. A simpler life was what he had in mind. Just the essentials, he said. He was 32 years old and was a writer in a way, but he was also an actor and a musician. He played the saxophone, performed occasionally with the Bay City Players, and was writing a first novel. He had been writing the novel since the time he lived in New York. One bleak Sunday afternoon in March, when he had again started talking about a change, a more honest life somewhere in the country, she'd mentioned, jokingly at first, her father's deserted place in the northwestern part of Washington.
"My God,"
Harry had said.
"You wouldn't mind? Roughing it, I mean? Living in the country like that."
I was born there, she said, laughing. Remember? I've lived in the country. It's all right. It has advantages. I could live there again. I don't know about you, though, Harry, if it'd be good for you. She kept looking at him, serious now. He felt lately that she was always looking at him.
"You wouldn't regret it?"
he said.
"Giving up things here?"
I wouldn't be giving up much, would I, Harry? She shrugged. But I'm not going to encourage the idea, Harry.
"Could you paint up there?"
he asked. I can paint anywhere, she said. And there's Bellingham, she said. There's a college there. Or else Vancouver or Seattle. She kept watching him. She sat on a stool in front of a shadowy, half-finished portrait of a man and a woman and rolled 2 paintbrushes back and forth in her hand. That was 3 months ago. They had talked about it, and now they were here. He rapped on the walls near the front door.
"Solid. A solid foundation. If you have a solid foundation, that's the main thing."
He avoided looking at her. She was shrewd and might have read something from his eyes. I told you not to expect too much, she said.
"Yes, you did. I distinctly remember,"
he said, still not looking at her. He gave the bare board another rap with his knuckles and moved over beside her. His sleeves were rolled up in the damp afternoon heat, and he was wearing white jeans and sandals.
"Quiet, isn't it?"
A lot different from the city.
"God, yes, pretty up here, too."
He tried to smile.
"Needs a little work, that's all. A little work. It'll be a good place if we want to stay. Neighbors won't bother us anyway."
We had neighbors here when I was a little girl, she said. You had to drive to see them, but they were neighbors. The door opened at an angle. The top hinge was loose, nothing much, Harry judged. They moved slowly from room to room. He tried to cover his disappointment. Twice he knocked on the walls and said,
"Solid." Or, "They don't make houses like this anymore. You can do a lot with a house like this."
She stopped in front of a large room and drew a long breath.
"Yours?"
She shook her head.
"And we could get the necessary furniture we need from your Aunt Elsie?"
Yes, whatever we need, she said. That is, if it's what we want, to stay here. I'm not pushing. It's not too late to go back. There's nothing lost. In the kitchen, they found a wood stove and a mattress pushed against one wall. In the living room again, he looked around and said,
"I thought it'd have a fireplace."
I never said it had a fireplace.
"I just had the impression for some reason it would have one. No outlets either,"
he said a moment later.
Then, "No electricity?"
Toilet either, she said. He wet his lips. Well, he said, turning away to examine something in the corner.
"I guess we could fix up one of those rooms with a tub and all and get someone to do the plumbing work, but electricity is something else, isn't it? I mean, let's face it, all these things, when we come to them, one thing at a time, right? Don't you think? Let's not let any of it get us down, okay?"
I wish you'd just be quiet, she said. She turned and went outside. He jumped down the steps a minute later and drew a breath of air, and they both lighted cigarettes. A flock of crows got up at the far end of the meadow and flew slowly and silently into the woods. They walked toward the barn, stopping to inspect the withered apple trees. He broke off one of the small, dry branches, turned it over and over in his hand while she stood beside him and smoked a cigarette. It was peaceful, more or less appealing country, and he thought it was pleasant to feel that something permanent, really permanent, might belong to him. He was taken by a sudden affection for this little orchard.
"Get these bearings again," he said. "Just need water and some looking after is all."
He could see himself coming out of the house with a wicker basket and pulling down large red apples, still wet with the morning's dew, and he understood that the idea was attractive to him. He felt a little cheered as they approached the barn. He examined briefly the old license plates nailed to the door. Green, yellow, white plates from the state of Washington, rusted now. 1922, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 34, 36, 37, 40, 41, 1949. He studied the dates as if he thought their sequence might disclose a code. He threw the wooden latch and pulled and pushed at the heavy door until it swung open. The air inside smelled unused, but he believed it was not an unpleasant smell. "It rains a lot here in the winter," she said. "I don't remember it ever being this hot in June." Sunlight stuck down through the splits in the roof. Once Dad shot a deer out of season. I was about, 8 or 9, around in there. She turned to him as he stood stopped near the door to look at an old harness that hung from a nail. "Dad was down here in the barn with the deer when the game warden drove into the yard. It was dark. Mother sent me down here for Dad, and the game warden, a big, heavy-set man with a hat, followed me. Dad was carrying a lamp just coming down from the loft. He and the game warden talked a few minutes. The deer was hanging there, but the game warden didn't say anything. He offered Dad a chew of tobacco, but Dad refused. He had never liked it and wouldn't take any even then. Then the game warden pulled my ear and left, but I don't want to think about any of that," she added quickly. "I haven't thought about things like that in years. I don't want to make comparisons," she said. "No," she said. She stepped back, shaking her head. "I'm not going to cry. I know that sounds melodramatic and just plain stupid, and I'm sorry for sounding melodramatic and stupid, but the truth is, Harry," she shook her head again, "I don't know. Maybe coming back here was a mistake. I can feel your disappointment."
"You don't know," he said.
"No, that's right, I don't know," she said. "And I'm sorry. I'm really not meaning to try to influence you one way or the other, but I don't think you want to stay. Do you?" He shrugged. He took out a cigarette. She took it from him and held it, waiting for a match, waiting for his eyes to meet hers over the match. "When I was little," she went on, "I wanted to be in a circus when I grew up. I didn't want to be a nurse or a teacher or a painter. I didn't want to be a painter then. I wanted to be Emily Horner, high wire artist. It was a big thing with me. I used to practice down here in the barn, walking the rafters, that big rafter up there. I walked that hundreds of times." She started to say something else, but puffed her cigarette and put it out under her heel, tamping it down carefully into the dirt. Outside the barn, he could hear a bird calling, and then he heard a scurrying sound over the boards up in the loft. She walked past him, out into the light, and started slowly through the deep grass towards the house.
"What are we going to do, Emily?"
he called after her. She stopped, and he came up beside her, Stay alive, she said. Then she shook her head and smiled faintly. She touched his arm. Jesus, I guess we are in kind of a spot, aren't we? But that's all I can say, Harry.
We've got to decide,
he said, not really knowing what he meant. You decide, Harry, if you haven't already. It's your decision. I'd just as soon go back if that makes it any easier for you. We'll stay with Aunt Elsie a day or two and then go back, all right? But give me a cigarette, will you? I'm going up to the house. He moved closer to her then and thought they might embrace. He wanted to. But she did not move. She only looked at him steadily, and so he touched her on the nose with his forefinger and said,
I'll see you in a little while.
He watched her go. He looked at his watch, turned, and walked slowly down the pasture toward the woods. The grass came up to his knees. Just before he entered the woods, as the grass began to thin out, he found a sort of path. He rubbed the bridge of his nose under his dark glasses, looked back at the house and the barn, and continued on slowly. A cloud of mosquitoes moved with his head as he walked. He stopped to light a cigarette. He brushed at the mosquitoes. He looked back again, but now he could not see the house or the barn. He stood there smoking, beginning to feel the silence that lay in the grass and in the trees and in the shadows farther back in the trees. Wasn't this what he longed for? He walked on, looking for a place to sit. He lighted another cigarette and leaned against a tree. He picked up some wood chips from the soft dirt between his legs. He smoked. He remembered a volume of plays by Gellerod lying on top of things in the back seat of the car, and then he recalled some of the little towns they had driven through that morning. Ferndale, Linden, Custer, Nooksack. He suddenly realized the mattress in the kitchen. He understood that it made him afraid. He tried to imagine Emily walking the big rafter in the barn, but that made him afraid too. He smoked. He felt very calm, really, all things considered. He wasn't going to stay here, he knew that, but it didn't upset him to know that now. He was pleased he knew himself so well. He would be all right, he decided. He was only 32, not so old. He was, for the moment, in a spot. He could admit that. After all, he considered, that was life, wasn't it? He put out the cigarette. In a little while, he lit another one. As he rounded a corner of the house, he saw her completing a cartwheel. She landed with a light thump, slightly crouched, and then she saw him. "Hey!" she yelled, grinning gravely. She raised herself onto the balls of her feet, arms out to the sides over her head, and then pitched forward. She turned 2 more cartwheels while he watched, and then she called, "How about this?" She dropped lightly onto her hands and, getting her balance, began a shaky, hesitant movement in his direction. Face flushed, blouse hanging over her chin, legs waving insanely, she advanced on him. "Have you decided?" she said, quite breathless. He nodded. "So?" she said. She let herself fall back against her shoulder and rolled onto her back, covering her eyes from the sun with an arm as if to uncover her breasts. She said, "Harry." He was reaching to light a cigarette with his last match when his hands began to tremble. The match went out, and he stood there holding the empty matchbook and the cigarette, staring at the vast expanse of trees at the end of the bright meadow. "Harry, we have to love each other," she said. "We'll just have to love each other," she said.